Fellas, the UFC matchmaking recently has been absolutely abysmal. Marcin Tybura versus Sergey Spivak, Verna Jandiroba versus Amanda Lemos. The UFC's roster is so big, we can't afford to be having these terrible fight nights. So I've gone through a list of a bunch of fights that I would make right now in the UFC if I was a matchmaker. We've got some title fights, we've got some fights between prospects, legends, we've got some #1 contender fights, fights of every caliber that I think make a lot of sense. I think they make a lot of sense for the fighters, for the fans, and I think they're genuinely good fights compared to the recent garbage that we've been getting recently. So this is the fights that I would make currently in the UFC. Any fights. We've also got some honourable mentions at the end that I would do. Honourable mentions are the fights that maybe aren't the big pay-per-view fights, but the fights that I'd still want to see if I was a matchmaker in the UFC. So let me know your thoughts on these matchups that I've got in this video, and if you have any of your own that I missed out on this list. But the first fight that I'll make is Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall. I don't need to tell you why this should be next. MMA fans across the world know why this should be next. It is the best versus the best in the heavyweight division, and nobody wants to see Stipe Miocic fight for the belt. Again, I'm not going to get into it too much because you all know why, but you've got Tom Aspinall, the champion of the world, interim champion of the world technically, who most would call the best heavyweight right now. I don't think it's hard to go with the opinion that Tom Aspinall's the best in the world right now. He's got really good grappling, dangerous KO power. I think he's beaten 5 opponents currently in the top 10. And you've got Jon Jones, who most would regard as the greatest of all time. And obviously, he's the current heavyweight champion of the world. And I think it's the perfect fight to make because this is one of those fights where I genuinely see Tom Aspinall not only beating, but finishing Jon Jones for the first time in his career. But at the same time, Jon Jones has pretty much dismantled every opponent that he's got against. So he has a big opportunity to do that to Tom Aspinall. It's the next guy versus the legend. It's the new star of the heavyweight division versus the old star in the UFC. Jones versus Aspinall. It's just the fight everyone wants to see. Nobody wants to see Stipe Miocic, who's 40-odd years old, haven't fought in a couple of years and he got KO'd in his last fight. No one wants to see that. Tom Aspinall, Jon Jones, the interim heavyweight champion versus the current heavyweight champion. I don't need to tell you why this is a good fight. Everyone knows already. But I would immediately do this matchup. It would be the first matchup I would make if I was a matchmaker for the UFC, and it doesn't need much explanation why. The next fight I would make is Alexander Volkanovski versus Aljamain Sterling. I've talked about this fight before. I think this is the best fight you can make for Alexander Volkanovski right now in the featherweight division. Obviously, he got KO'd in his last 2 fights. He needs to take some time off, and I don't think there's a better fight for him to come back to than Aljamain Sterling. Now, Sterling, I'm pretty sure is booked at UFC 307 against Evloev, but I would love this fight because first reason, it's a danger-free matchup for Alexander Volkanovski. The whole reason we want Volkanovski to take some time off is so that he doesn't come back and get chinned by an up-and-coming contender. That ain't happening against Aljamain Sterling. He's got pillow fists. He's a terrible striker. Volkanovski would absolutely demolish Aljamain Sterling on the feet. And when it comes to grappling, Volkanovski's a really good wrestler. He showed that in his first fight with Islam Makhachev. He showed that against Yair Rodriguez. We all know Volkanovski's a really good wrestler. And obviously, Aljamain Sterling's got that wrestling threat as well. We know that Sterling's a good fighter at 145 when he came up and dominated Calvin Kattar with his grappling. It's 2 former champions going at it. 2 big names going at it. If Sterling can beat Volkanovski, that's one of the best wins that he's got on his resume, and he can get a title shot from that. And if Volkanovski can beat a former champion in Aljamain Sterling, again, another great win for his resume, and Volkanovski would be back. I think it's one of the best fights you can make. It's danger-free. Volkanovski doesn't have to worry about getting chinned. The only threat from Sterling is the grappling, which Volkanovski has shown that he's got great defensive grappling before. Volkanovski, Sterling, 2 big names going at it, 2 former champions going at it, and I would love for this fight to be made in like November, December. I still want Volkanovski to take time off. I don't want him to be back too soon, so maybe later on this year, maybe early next year, I would do Volkanovski versus Sterling on a pay-per-view somewhere, maybe like a co-main event for a pay-per-view, and I think it's quite possibly the best fight you can make for Volkanovski in the featherweight division. So I would do Volkanovski versus Sterling as one of the fights that I'll make next. The next fight we've got is Dustin Poirier versus Justin Gaethje. Now, I did a video a couple of days ago where I matchmade the UFC lightweight division. This was one of those fights, and I still stand by that. Now, I don't think this is the only fight that they can both have. I know there's been a lot of other names thrown into the mix. People have been talking about Charles Oliveira being a potential opponent for one of these guys. Some people have even said Nate Diaz. But I feel like the reason I've chosen this fight is because it's reliable. You know it's going to be a good fight. When Poirier and Justin Gaethje are booked to fight each other, you just know what you're getting. You know the product you're getting. It's going to be an absolute banger, and it's probably not going to go the distance. They're 1-1 against each other, both in finishes as well. They need to settle the score. They're not going to get a title shot again. They're title aspirations are over. I feel like they've only got 1 or 2 more fights left, and Poirier's hinted towards retirement. What better way to retire than having a scrap against Justin Gaethje, a guy that you fought twice before, a guy that you always put on bangers with, and another fellow legend in the lightweight division. I feel like it's a fight that nobody can really complain about because you know what you're getting. It's between 2 legends, Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, both on the back end of their career. I wouldn't call them washed as of right now. They still look really good in the performance that they've had recently. But no, Gaethje, Poirier, a reliable fight between 2 legends that I would love to see in the lightweight division. I'd also like to see Poirier versus Diaz. I wouldn't mind seeing them against Oliveira, but, you know, it's just a reliable fight. You know it's going to be, a banger. We're not feeding them to an up-and-coming prospect. We're just letting them have a nice fight at the end of their career that's going to be an absolute banger, and it's going to be the epitome of violence. Poirier, Gaethje is a fight that I would make next. The next fight I would make is for Khamzat Chimaev, and I would book him against Jared Cannonier. He's been talking about how he wants a title shot or a #1 contender fight. What has he done to earn a big fight in the middleweight division? In his last fight, he beat Kamaru Usman. Fair play, that's a good win, but at the same time, he was on 2 weeks' notice. He was on 10 days' notice. It was in a completely different weight class for Kamaru Usman. It was a draw, in my opinion. Before that, he beat Kevin Holland when he ruined an entire event when he was scheduled to fight Nate Diaz when he missed weight by like 8 pounds. Before that, he beat Gilbert Burns by the skin of his teeth. He doesn't deserve a title shot. He had the opportunity to have a #1 contender fight when he got scheduled to fight Robert Whittaker and he pulled out. We need to give him a middleweight, and we need to stop treating Chimaev like he's the next guy in line. Give him Jared Cannonier, who in my opinion is still one of the top middleweights in the world. He's dangerous. He's a high output, dangerous boxer, as he showed in that fight with Marvin Vettori. He had a bit of a... I know he just got finished by Imavov, but it was a really early stoppage. I feel like he could have gone longer. Cannonier, Chimaev, it's the perfect fight. If Chimaev beats Cannonier, fair play, he's got a good win. Throw him in a #1 contender fight. And if Cannonier can beat Chimaev, that's by far the best win on his resume, and that's going to put Cannonier straight back into the title picture again. Chimaev, Cannonier should be next, in my opinion, for Khamzat Chimaev, rather than just giving him another #1 contender fight that he hasn't earned. But it's also a fight where we can really see how good Chimaev is. Chimaev, Cannonier, I think that should be the fight for Chimaev. The next fight is a bit of a Legends fight, and it is between Jose Aldo and Henry Cejudo. It's a Legends fight. You've got Jose Aldo, former featherweight champion, probably the greatest featherweight of all time, against Henry Cejudo, a guy that has held 2 belts before, one of the greatest of all time as well. In MMA, it's just a fight that you can't really complain about. I don't think... I mean, first of all, for Cejudo, he's been calling it, saying that he wants to fight at 145. Just get 145 out of your mind. They would all absolutely destroy you. They're all bigger than you as well. You're way too small for that division and you get murked. Fight Jose Aldo. He's come off a really good performance against Jonathan Martinez. I'm sure he wants that win that can push him closer to that belt. And beating Cejudo, who's just fought the 2 top guys in the division in Merab and, well, at the time, Sterling, is the perfect fight to do that. Obviously, 2 big names as well in the bantamweight division. Cejudo, Aldo, it's a clash of styles between 2 legends. And Cejudo wants to get back in the title picture as well. If he can beat Jose Aldo, who's coming off a good performance over Jonathan Martinez, there's no better win to do it too. It's a really good fight between 2 legends. Jose Aldo, Henry Cejudo. I think this should be next in the bantamweight division, in my opinion, for both of them. And then another legends fight that you can make is Cody Garbrandt versus Dominic Cruz. They've had a rivalry before. It was one of the biggest fights in bantamweight history, one of the biggest title fights in history in any division. Cody Garbrandt absolutely dominated Dominic Cruz in their last fight, and I think it should be made again. Listen, again, title aspirations are over for both of them. Don't feed them to another up-and-coming prospect. Put them against each other. It's a massive fight. I think this should have been on UFC 300 instead of Cody Garbrandt and Davison Figueiredo. Now, for Dominic Cruz, he's still ranked, and I still wouldn't call... I mean, he's definitely washed a little bit, but he's still definitely got some skill, because he didn't look too bad against Marlon Vera, but he did get killed in his last fight. He hasn't fought in a couple of years, and he's just kind of sat in the ranking, and I don't really know what he's trying to do with his career. And Cody Garbrandt, he just got finished by Davison Figueiredo. He's still very chinny, but to be honest, it wasn't that long ago when he got that good performance against Brian Kelleher. Cody Garbrandt, Dominic Cruz, put them against each other, a legends fight. Imagine this is a fight night main event. Who is complaining? We've seen them go at it before. It was history. Why not see them go at it again? It's a step down in competition from what they both just had. Cody Garbrandt, Dominic Cruz, legends fight. Should have been on UFC 300. Now is the perfect opportunity to make it again. Dominic Cruz, Cody Garbrandt, I want to see this fight. And then the next fight is not between 2 legends, but instead between 2 prospects. Peyton Talbott and Adrian Yanez. Now, technically, Adrian Yanez is no longer a prospect. He was once in the same position of Peyton Talbott, and then he got throat checked by Rob Font, and then obviously got destroyed by Jonathan Martinez. But Peyton Talbott's one of the biggest prospects in the bantamweight division. He called for Adrian Yanez, and I think it should be the fight that should be next. Listen, if Peyton Talbott can beat Adrian Yanez, who was once in the same position of him, that's definitely his best win so far. It's his biggest test so far, and beating Adrian Yanez is going to start the conversation for Peyton Talbott potentially facing some ranked opponents. And for Adrian Yanez, if he can throat check Peyton Talbott, who was in the same position that he was once in, that's a massive win for Adrian Yanez, and he's got a lot of hype back on his name as well. I think this would be such a high-level striking matchup. It would be an absolute war on the feet. They're both such good boxers. I'd love to see this fight between Peyton Talbott and Adrian Yanez. Big opportunity for Talbott. So Peyton Talbott versus Adrian Yanez is the fight I would make next. They've both called each other out. Obviously, Peyton Talbott called out Adrian Yanez on the mic. Yanez has agreed on social media. I just don't understand why anyone wouldn't want to see this fight. It would be an absolute war. It's a banger. Talbott versus Yanez, two young, hungry guys in the bantamweight division going at it. You can't complain. The next fight I've got is a women MMA fight, and it is Alexa Grasso versus Zhang Weili. This is an easy co-main event for a pay-per-view. I know whenever they do women MMA fights, title fights for a co-main event of a pay-per-view, there's a lot of complaints. But this is probably one of the few women MMA fights in the UFC that I would actually like to see. You've got Grasso, who looks unstoppable in her division. You've got Weili, who looks unstoppable in her division. They're both really good grapplers. Grasso's got amazing jiu-jitsu. Weili's got a relentless grappling pace. They're both really good on the feet. And if they can both get a couple more defenses, Grasso versus Weili is actually one of the most interesting female title fights you can make right now. And I would say that this is a super fight in women MMA. You know, you've got two defending champions, the fan favorite champions as well. We're not including Pennington in this. Grasso versus Weili for a co-main event of a pay-per-view. This is a massive title fight right here against each other. Two champions going at it as well. I'd love to see this fight a lot. And like I said, women MMA, the title fights, you know, they get a lot of slack. They get a lot of disagreements, but this is one of them that you just can't really complain about. It's not like they're regularly in boring fights as well. I'm not saying they're in absolute bangers every single fight, but they're not boring fighters. So Grasso versus Weili is probably one of the fights that I would do to save women MMA. Probably the best fight you can possibly make in women MMA right now, to be honest. So Grasso, Weili, co-main event of a pay-per-view. That's one of the best female title fights you can make right now. I'm not saying it makes the most sense right now though, because I still think they need a couple more defenses before they face each other. But you know, rack up one or two more defenses. Who says no to Grasso versus Weili? So I'd do that next for women MMA. The next fight we've got is Tony Ferguson versus Nick Diaz. Now, obviously, they're both fighting on the UFC Abu Dhabi card later this year, but it doesn't really make sense how they're fighting different opponents. Obviously, Ferguson's facing Marco Chiesa, and Nick Diaz is facing Vicente Luque. It would have made a lot more sense to put them against each other. You've got two guys who were once at the top of the UFC. Now they're both washed. They're both old. They both desperately need a win. They're both past their expiry date. Why are they not against each other? The first reason is at least one of them are getting a win. At least we either get to see Ferguson finally get his hand raised, or Nick Diaz is going to get a win in the UFC. At least one of them is going to get a win. So I feel like it makes a lot of sense. They're not going to be absolutely destroyed because they're not going to, you know, insanely hurt each other. We're not feeding them to a dangerous prospect. We're not feeding them to a killer. They're both on the other end of their career. They've both probably got one or two fights left. Why not put two legends against each other? It's a chance for Tony Ferguson to avenge his loss against Nate Diaz by beating another Diaz. Why not, man? Why not do Nick Diaz versus Ferguson? Two legends going at it. Two guys who desperately need a win. We finally get to see one of them get a win. No one wants to see Ferguson get beaten by Marco Chiesa. Nobody wants to see Nick Diaz get beaten by Vicente Luque. And even though, unfortunately, one of them would, you know, definitely lose this fight, at least one of them also definitely win. Diaz, Ferguson, put them against each other. I just don't understand why this wasn't used for Abu Dhabi. I think this should have been the fight that they'd gone for. So Ferguson versus Diaz is the one that I would have gone for. And then we've got Caio Borrallo versus Marvin Vettori. Now, Caio Borrallo is one of the biggest prospects in middleweight right now. There's a lot of prospects in the middleweight division, but Caio Borrallo is definitely one of the biggest. And he needs a big fight. He just KO'd Paul Craig. He's entered the rankings. He needs a big fight now that he's got a lot of momentum. And I feel like Marvin Vettori is that perfect fight for him. Vettori, he's been out for so long. His last fight was in like June, July last year, when he got absolutely dominated by Jared Cannonier. He hasn't fought since, and I feel like it's a good comeback fight for Vettori to fight an up-and-coming prospect in Caio Borrallo. If Caio Borrallo can beat Marvin Vettori, which I think he has a good chance of doing because his striking's really good, and he seems to be improving really fast as Caio Borrallo, and he's at Fighting Nerds, which is a great gym. If he can beat Marvin Vettori, he's straight into contendership just like that, easily getting a top 5 opponent from there. And if Vettori can shut down the prospect of Caio Borrallo, he's just shut down a big prospect. He can then get another top 5 fight from there. I know there's limited options for Vettori because he has fought a lot of the people in the division already, but it's a big win for Marvin Vettori to get his name back out there. Caio Borrallo, Marvin Vettori, prospect versus a guy that's already cemented himself in the division. I don't understand why you wouldn't want to see this matchup. It would be a fun striking matchup as well. Like I said, Caio Borrallo's improving his striking a lot. He's got really good striking. Marvin Vettori's a great boxer. Vettori, Borrallo, I think this should be next for both of them. And then those are the main fights done. And now we've just got a few honourable mentions, which maybe wouldn't be able to headline a pay-per-view or a fight night, but would still be really big fights. The first one I've got is Derek Lewis versus Rosenstruck. Now, this potentially could main event a fight night. This is just a fight that I don't understand why people don't want to see. Two guys who look the same, two guys who hit extremely hard, two guys that have lost to a majority of the guys at the top, but have done enough to keep themselves in the rankings, two chill power punchers in the division. I don't understand why they haven't fought each other yet, and why they aren't booked against each other. Obviously, Rosenstruck's booked against Taito Ivaza at UFC 305. But it's a fight that we need to see. I just want to see this fight because it's going to end in a KO. No one's going to know who got KO'd because they look the same. It's just a fight that I think we need to see in the heavyweight division. A fight night main event. That's an easy fight night main event in front of a crowd. Rosenstruck, Lewis, putting them against each other. One of them are getting KO'd. It's just a fight that I think I would book right now if I was the matchmaker in the UFC. The next one is Bo Nickal versus Chris Curtis. I've booked them against each other before, and I still think this is a great fight. Bo Nickal's got a lot of momentum on his name, and I think even though it might be too early on in his career for him to get a ranked opponent because he's just come off a win over Cody Brundage, I think Chris Curtis is a really dangerous fight for Bo Nickal, but it's also a big opportunity for Bo Nickal because obviously if he can beat Chris Curtis, he's now going to be a ranked guy, and he's now finally got into the rankings, which is what he would have wanted when he joined the UFC, and he's gone from a prospect to a potential contender. He's beaten Chris Curtis. It's his best win yet, and from there he's going to get massive fights. And for Chris Curtis, if he can beat Bo Nickal, he's just shut down one of the biggest prospects in the UFC. And I think Chris Curtis has a really good chance of beating Bo Nickal. Bo Nickal's a really good wrestler, but Chris Curtis has some of the best takedown defense in the middleweight division. You got to remember, a few years ago, Chris Curtis had like a 100% takedown defense record. So I think he has a really good chance of beating Bo Nickal. So I'll do Bo Nickal, Chris Curtis, or a prospect versus a ranked guy. Why not? And then the final fight I've got on this list is Dan Ige versus Gene Silva. This should just be a banger. We know that Dan Ige's game. He showed that when he fought Diego Lopez on like a couple hours notice. Gene Silva is one of the biggest prospects in the featherweight division right now. Obviously coming off that really good win over Drew Dober and Charles Jourdain. Both of them in which he got a KO. And he needs a ranked opponent. Dan Ige's come off a few losses against ranked guys. He needs to welcome somebody else in the division. I think this would be an absolute banger between two dangerous strikers. A prospect versus a ranked opponent. Dan Ige, Gene Silva, who the fuck says no? But those are the matchups that I would make if I was currently a matchmaker for the UFC. And we've got a lot of fights there that I think will be fun, a lot of bangers. And yeah, let me know your thoughts on these matchups and what other matchups you would add. Thank you for watching.